Now, we're at a stage in a relationship where both Australia and India have a multi-pronged approach to the relationship, whether it be the annual leaders summit, whether it be the Quad, the Financial Action Task Force, G20. However, we have seen that the ECTA has been the fundamental platform for economic engagement. And also at the same time, both sides are also sort of negotiating a bilateral CECA as well. So with that being said, this panel is likely going to focus on essentially what have been the sectors in the last few years after the ECTA, which we can essentially do a deep dive on. Before the CECA is signed, have there been any major wins? Have there been any major successes when it comes to the ECTA, which we can sort of follow through in the form of a CECA? The idea behind this is that if we're going to go into the next phase of the relationship economically, we sort of need to sort of really zero in on the sectors which have actually shown the potential to, sort of enhance economic partnership. So with that being said, I'd like to first go to Paul Grimes. Paul, great to have you here. As somebody who is the CEO of Austrade, right, you sort of enable and facilitate a lot of, economic engagements. What, in your view, in this uncertain trade environment, sort of this geopolitical environment, and Australia clearly relies a lot on international trade, how do you see, or what, as per your vantage point, has been the big successes between India and Australia when it comes to bilateral economic cooperation with sectors?
Maybe to start off with recapping some of the key work that we do with great support and great energy from High Commissioner Philip Green, DFAT staff and colleagues across the region. The Austrade team is very, very engaged at that practical stage of driving trade and investment between Australia and India. Indeed, over the last year, Austrade facilitated over 1,100 individual commercial transactions in the South Asia region. The bulk of those, of course, being in India. And it does emphasise the importance of us moving from high-level aspirations to practical actions. If we call out some of the great highlights, and that was the thrust of the question of the last couple of years, I think it is that growth that we've seen in trade off the back of the ECTA agreement. I think it was a reflection this morning, and all of us in the room would understand the important notion that partnerships are built on strong foundations, and the free trade agreement that we have through ECTA gives us an opportunity to build those foundations for trade, and we have seen that in practical outcomes. There was that reflection on that key statistic of the very significant growth in our bilateral trade to $50 billion in the most recent set of statistics, and a very significant rate of growth in our non-coal exports to India. So off the back of the ECTA agreement, we have seen strong growth in areas such as some of those key agricultural products. Have been an important area of growth. Of course, a key foundation of our relationship is just the depth of the educational relationship that we have. High Commissioner Green this morning was calling out the very important opportunities that we have in transnational education, with Australian institutions now becoming established with branch campuses in India. I see as being a very, very important development, and is going to strengthen our relationship further. But I'm looking forward to, in this panel, starting to talk about some of the opportunities to take the relationship forward to the next level, which was a theme that came out of also the first two sessions, deepening the investment relationship, and also looking forward to opportunities to broaden the trade relationship. We do have an opportunity, if the ECTA agreement is upgraded into the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement, the CECA, that will give an opportunity for greater growth in our trade, two-way trade between the two countries.
Thank you, Paul. I just want to, again, double-click on something here. Austrade came out a few days back with a report on India and Australia agriculture cooperation. And I bring this up because I think in the first two panels, we've actually spoken about how we want to diversify cooperation from, the areas where we have normally cooperated on in the past to more tech-enabled areas, right? So I think the Austrade report sort of kind of flags agriculture technology, especially from space-enabled agriculture as well. Even if you're talking about geospatial imagery to sort of, map, all the farmlands, or if you're talking about sort of, AI-enabled kind of tech to look at the soil content and look at it, how that might be eventually used by the farmers. What has been the finding? Because I understand that this Austrade report actually tracks 60 live cases of, kind of India and Australia farming farmland and basically tech being used to essentially make it happen. What have been the findings there?
So ag tech is a very important area, and it really, one of the things that was called out this morning was the importance of us focusing on areas where we have comparative advantage. And in ag tech and agriculture more broadly, Australia has significant established comparative advantage, and we have capabilities that we can offer in partnership to India as India looks to build the agricultural industry and move it to a higher technology phase. I would call out the foundational work that has been done by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. Our relationship with India goes back many, many, many decades, where Australia has been a fundamental partner in driving those innovations in India around the green revolution, which was foundational in bringing so many hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in India. As we move to the next stage, we have established strengths in dry land agriculture, particularly operating in environments where rainfall might be scarce, which is very important in many regions of India, and of course also in tropical agriculture as well, which is our geographies. We're in the southern hemisphere, India's in the northern hemisphere, but they actually traverse very, very similar sort of agricultural conditions. As a result, the capabilities, technology that we've developed here in Australia, including around water management, is directly applicable in India and is one of those shining lights where we can build on an established area of comparative advantage to build our partnership further.
Thank you, Paul. Honourable Minister, great to have you here. New South Wales is known as a state in Australia which attracts the most investment, and industrialization has been a big role in that. We talk about comparative advantage, right? And I think something which came up earlier today was data centers. I understand that New South Wales is very keen to sort of have a sustainable approach to building data centers. India too has sort of embarked on a sort of plan where various Indian states are actually now seeking and also attracting investment in data centers. What would be sort of the New South Wales pitch to sort of, work with countries like India? I understand New South Wales has an MOU with Singapore, so it clearly has a country-centric approach as well. What would be that sort of, low-hanging fruit when we talk about data center collaboration with countries like India?
Well, look, certainly, data centres and the digital economy is already here, and the New South Wales government is focused on making sure that we continue to attract investment in the foundation of that digital economy, which is obviously the data centres. Now, at the core of data centre development, I think you require three fundamental things. You need land, you need water, and you need obviously energy. And those things are actually interrelated with each other. And I believe our aspiration, the New South Wales government's aspiration, is actually to be the digital data centre capital of the Asia Pacific region, because some of our trading neighbours in Southeast Asia, they actually lack some of those three core fundamentals. You look at our very good friends in Singapore, they don't have a lot of land. Water and energy is a real challenge for them, and I think this is where you think of trade now as being more than just tangible goods and services, but actually about intangible products. In this case, it's actually data. And of course, we'll be working closely with our Commonwealth friends. I see my good friend Tim here, and of course Dr. Paul Grimes, to think about how does the transnational trade in digital data work in between like-minded and trusted trading partners. And India has to be part of that equation for the future as well. Not noting the fact that, of course, India produces millions of software engineers and IT specialist experts. We can't avoid and we can't ignore that level of intellectual resource when it comes to the partnership, to making sure that there are really, I think, mutual gains that both countries and both nations can actually obtain from that. So I think practical partnerships, really encouraging investment in two ways, and of course working with our Commonwealth friends to see how that future of trade works in the export and the trade of intangible product like data.
Thank you. Hi, Pramit. Pramit, you've spoken in the past about resilience, right? Which has now clearly evolved from becoming a buzzword of sorts in the past 5 years to becoming something very real for India, where actually India has been on this kind of a run of doing a lot of FTAs, right? So here we are sort of in a situation now where India essentially has always argued for decades on that we should have our own choice of economic partners. We should be able to talk to who we want to. And now finally, the ambition has kind of, caught up with the reality where India indeed is now sort of, striking all these FTAs with so many countries. Where do you situate the ECTA amidst this recent, signing of FTAs? What is the value addition there? Because we're talking about the comparative advantage issue again. How do you, possibly situate the ECTA amidst this range of FTAs signed by India?
So I think in many ways what we're seeing in India is a story in the trade front of, as you know, India's been a largely protectionist economy for most of its history, still retains a fair number of barriers, especially in agriculture. But what we're now starting is both a recognition and a capability in terms of exports. If you look at the export basket of India, it's been changing over the past 3-4 decades. We've added automotive parts and cars, we've added engineering products, and now the fastest rising, and in fact the single largest export, is electronics. And so we're many ways, if you look back at what China was doing, or China began its export story back 50 years ago, that's exactly the kind of path they took. And so now your game is to, as you expand, you need to export. A lot of these companies that export from India are looking to India to export from India. They're looking and saying, but where are your FTAs? If I'm going to export like Apple, 85% of my production out of your country, I need to have a tariff guarantee as to where I'm selling to. And so you need FTAs to bring in investors into India to bring the kind of scale we need. If I'm Walmart, who's promised to export $20 billion worth of products from India, Amazon making a similar agreement, I think they've promised $40 billion of sourcing. Again, they said, where are your FTAs? Because without them, I cannot make that kind of a promise. And so you see a first set of FTAs coming out. I think with Australia in many ways was a forerunner in this, and then with the UAE and so on, countries that we were, reasonably safe about our trade relationships with and close by. And now you're starting to see India expand. And the biggest shift has been the European Union, a really large, difficult trading partner in many ways to negotiate with. The United States now on another scale in terms of difficulty, but slowly getting there, we hope. But now you're starting to see companies like, Haseong of South Korea, Facheng of Taiwan, building export hubs for footwear, for T-shirts, and other products. Until now, India's simply not been part of the international supply chain story. So I think in many ways, Australia was a confidence-building measure for us, the FTA that we did. And now you're starting to do, we did one in New Zealand in 8 months or something like that. And now we're looking at a one in Canada that will be completed presumably by the end of this year. We're now looking at Chile, at Mercosur, and parts of the world that India never bothered to even have embassies. So that trade story is transformational, and Australia, quite rightly, was the beginning in that story. And now with the CECA, hopefully it will be the second generation of reforms that we're going to be looking for. And there, I would say, mobility is going to be part of that story, but technology, supply chain integration, And as the next panel, we'll have one on critical minerals. That's going to be a big story now, because that's going to be strategic issues combined with commercial enterprise. But yes, the Australian agreement was the beginning of the Indian trade, a new trade policy. And somebody mentioned the earlier panel, the CPTPP is there as the sort of the target, the really big pot of gold that we were the government's looking at and saying, in India, do we have the courage to go down that path? And I know Tokyo definitely every day is telling India, please consider at least parts of the CPTPP. You don't have to take everything right now, but begin that process. And I think all of these combined together will hopefully lead us in that direction.
Thanks, Pramit. So you mentioned about the export basket sort of changing the composition in the last 5 years, right? But if I were to offer an observation here, it would be that India sort of struck these FTAs kind of after Apple had already made the commitment to invest into India. Same with Micron in India as well, right? So now we're seeing this new flurry of FTAs being struck, where I think India is not just trying to navigate for cost-effective exports, but also cost-effective intermediate inputs as well. So I think that's something which is also happening increasingly now, where the FTAs seek to serve as a kind of an enabling mechanism for India to source more cheaply, if I may add so. Now, to that point, right, in the earlier panels, we also spoke about there being champions, right? And frankly, from Carnegie's point of view, where I work, we have seen how the US-India Trust Partnership actually really got going because we had certain big firms make some huge bets, right? Which happened like with the Micron deal and the GE deal. Who are the champions on both sides in India and Australia who are likely to sort of, be the initial sort of, people who pursue the Pathfinder projects? Is there somebody in mind, or would there be any specific sectors which we can zero in on?
So Australia and India are very different and Australia is different from the United States. I mean, Apple is virtually a giant country all by itself. Its financial reserves are the size of a medium-sized country. Apple made a gamble in India. It's not like this was an automatic decision. And they spent 2 years carefully talking to the Indian system and saying, because their initial rounds with Indian bureaucrats, Indian, oh, you will come here because we are a domestic market. And they said, no, you're not a domestic market big enough for Apple. We're sorry. In fact, you're nothing compared to what Apple needs in terms of what it wants to make production. Because it's not just, and the point is, Apple comes in and says, we will export 80% of our production from India. And this will be partly geopolitical. And we will absorb the losses that we expect. I mean, Apple did not make a profit in the first 2 or 3 years that they were here. But what's happened is now, as you've mentioned on the intermediaries, we're now seeing, I was at a meeting with Corningware. Corningware makes the Gorilla Glass that's there. They said, we had 20 plants in China. We're now building 8 plants in India. And we will build Gorilla Glass all across India. And optic fibers. They're leaders in optic fiber technology around the world. Taiwanese told me when I went to Taiwan, they said, we had about 10 Taiwanese companies in your country, and one of them made whiskey, so that doesn't really count. Now there are over 200 Taiwanese companies in India making all sorts of electronic components, partly for Apple, but also now for Foxconn, also for Tata Electronics. And slowly you're seeing that electronics ecosystem build up, and it's going now well beyond just Apple. So the game, I think, now for us is now to spread this into more and more sectors. It's difficult with Australia and India because neither of us are big enough, and this is a problem middle powers always have, is we are not superpowers. We don't have giant multinationals that have the capacity to absorb the costs of these kind of investments over a period of 5, 6 years. And they don't necessarily, I don't think any of us have a company that dominates an entire supply chain the way Apple does, right? But what we can do is to find we have niche areas that we are good at, and try to at least get segments of those supply chains, and maybe working with a third country like a Japan or so on and so forth. But the one area which sort of obviously comes to mind is in the mineral space and the mining space, because there is an area where definitely India may have resources, it has demand. It doesn't, unfortunately, have very good mining companies. We only have a handful of decent ones. We've strangled our mining industry for decades. This is an area where Australia obviously is very, very powerful. But I think the game there is not to look just beyond the standard ores and so on. What we're seeing out of the Persian Gulf conflict right now is that something simple as sulfur has become a huge global problem. When you talk to, I was in Japan talking to Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, these giant Japanese companies, and I said, what's your biggest mineral concern over the next 2 decades? They said copper, overwhelmingly. They said the copper demand is skyrocketing globally. Copper production is like this, and there are not too many places that you have. And there are also not too many companies that know how to process copper in the standards that we want. Helium is a byproduct of LNG. It is a product of steel. It is a product of so many other industry processes. But capturing it and purifying it, very few people know how to do this. Sulfur, which is otherwise a substance that nobody thought is basically serious a concern at all. It is now, we now suddenly realize, oh my God, it's used for fertilizer. It's used for almost everything. It's used for making copper. It's used for everything, making matches or whatever. And suddenly we realize we're all dependent on Qatar or someplace like that for all of our sulfur. These are the kind of areas we need to be developing. It has to be strategic. And everybody knows the shadow, because behind all of this is that especially when you move into some strategic areas, there's a Chinese company that's going to come in and crash the price and drive you out of those areas. So that's where your governments have to sit down and say, we need to guarantee a certain set of sales, protect these areas from predatory pricing that we know is geopolitically driven. And that's going to be part of, doesn't have to necessarily be part of a free trade agreement, but definitely should be where a Quad plus agreement and so on is needed to create that type of supply chain integration.
Thanks, Pramit. So I take it that there's no easy answer to this question. I mean, you'll have to work on the linkages. You'll have to sort of identify those players early on and then really create an ecosystem around them to really make it going. Hi, sir. To this point about, you had given an interview early on where you spoke about linkages. You spoke about how FTAs, actually what they really do is that they create an ecosystem which enables players in the ecosystem to have some linkages with each other. Now, this is the same question I asked earlier as well, but I will see an answer again. I'll see if there's an answer for this question, but essentially, in the ECTA, have you seen any linkages come up in the last few years? Have you seen any, small green shoots, in terms of Indian and Aussie enterprises working together?
Thanks, Konark. But before I start, I just wanted to thank the organizers for this, I think, a wonderful sessions that we've been having. I should have realized I'm speaking after Pramit, and he would take away most of my talking points. But having said that, let me wear the hat that I've worn for over 2 decades now, working closely with industry on how to make use of the FTAs or whatever nomenclature you have there, and how do you actually convert that into business? How do you take it, and how you have those agreements there. One of the first things when I started doing this, when I used to be with the CII, was that most people didn't know what an FTA meant. It was something which was happening somewhere else, and then the industry seriously thought that it didn't matter to them. They were more interested in the domestic market. Having been someone who's been talking about multilateralism for decades now, since the WTO has been there, it's all got turned in its head. Thanks to tariffs now coming back, we now have those geopolitical tensions across. What does that mean for the India-Australia ECTA, and what does it mean for that from an industry perspective? It means that there is a need for 2 things I would put there. One is a greater understanding of what this means to industry. The industry seriously doesn't know. We're talking here, we're talking among the government, but industry on the ground seriously doesn't know what it means to come and export to Australia and what it means to export from Australia to India. And that's something which we do as a firm. We work very closely with industry to try and explain it to them. But there are huge challenges on both sides, and it's just because it's not that they think it's a barrier. It's not a barrier, it's just a measure. But I think it needs to be understood well. Most of the Indian companies which want to export agricultural products into Australia find that it's too cumbersome to do it for them. That's because they don't understand what it means to be exporting into Australia. And I think, therefore, some of the things which we do is to try and explain to them that you need to follow these measures. It could be something as simple as MRL levels, of pesticide when you're exporting an agricultural product. The second thing is one. I've been hearing since morning many of the products being talked about. One sector which I think has got missed is pharma. India has a huge potential of exporting generics into Australia. But then we need to ensure that we meet the regulations that the Australians are looking for. Something which the pharma industry doesn't understand is if we can export it to the world, why not Australia? Why should Australia be any different from where it is? But I think they need a greater understanding of what it means to export maybe pharma into Australia. And that's something where maybe Australia should actually work on, because that's a sector which I didn't hear at all in the morning since we've been talking about. We keep talking about critical minerals, something which from a services perspective, we keep talking about movement of professionals. But I think something which is far more critical is if you look at any manufacturing product, 70% of that is services. And what does that mean? If you break it up and see, do you have access and do you have technology and can you build linkages? Just in the services part, for manufacturing a product is something which will get you far more, linkages between India and Australia. Something which has happened in the last year or so, not just the geopolitical tensions, the last 4 weeks have also told us that what we thought was normal is no longer normal. And therefore, we need far more partners as industry. We look for far more partners. I think we need to expand the market. And I think Australia comes in very easily there in terms of trying to build that. And I think this morning I heard someone saying that there are no choke points between India and Australia. And I agree. That would be something very interesting to look at.
Sure. I had a follow-up query, though. But, one of India's advantages generally has been in the R&D space, at least in terms of the talent, right? So we're talking about the agreement we have with the UK, EU, with Singapore as well. What would Australia sort of offer to the mobility of the individuals who are seeking to sort of work in the service sector? If you're going to be talking about, co-creation, co-production, at least in the R&D space, individuals would have to be able to travel seamlessly, right? So if I may ask, what would be sort of that advantage which Australia would offer to Indian professionals who are probably, looking at working in Australia, UK, UAE and Singapore as well? What would be the advantage over there?
Konark, if I answer that slightly differently, the problem is ever since I've been talking about movement of professionals from the 90s when the WTO came into place, it's always been misunderstood as immigration. While the movement of professionals is nothing about immigration, it's about people coming in, doing the service, and going back to your home country. And I think somewhere, that's got lost in terms of movement of people. And I think we need to start talking about it far more openly. I think every time India talks about skilled personnel coming in somewhere, it's always seen by the host country as someone that Indians want to move into that country. And I think we need to be far more clearer that it is not about them moving there permanently, but the fact that they'll go there, provide a service, and they're coming back. R&D certainly is an area where we can do a lot of work together. But it doesn't necessarily only have to be done in Australia. We can do that with institutes in India. If you're able to build those linkages between Australian institutes and India, and if you can have data centers in India and you can have the GCCs running in India, we can also do R&D in India. So I think we should start looking towards that, and I think building that would bring in far more linkages, especially when it comes to movement of professionals.
Thank you, sir. Hi, Minister. On the question of R&D again, right? Staying on that topic for a while now, it's generally been observed in India that it is the smaller enterprises, the MSMEs, the startups, who actually invest more into R&D compared to the larger firms. And one such area where there actually has been cooperation between the Indians and the Australians has been in space, right? Sydney hosted the International Astronautical Congress last year, got a huge sort of, commitment from people coming all over the world. Indian firms too sort of have been partnering with the space program here in Australia. What would be sort of some, low-hanging fruits there again in terms of space cooperation? Because that is one area where Australia and India both fare really well.
Look, I think firstly, it's about trying to humanise what the space industry actually means to the layman's out there across the country, across both countries in one sense. It's not about astronauts and rockets. It's actually about everyday digital technology that we use, how we do our financial transactions through the banks, how we use our mobile devices, how we actually get data, how we actually use the digital economy for the future. And if we actually then explain that in a lived impact way, then that actually could really stimulate the part partnerships that you need, in particular from the smaller, medium end, and in particular, if they're actually private companies. So I think the role for government here is actually, A, to explain that, what the space industry means. It's a huge growth industry for both countries. You've got great workforce, great educational institutions, and those partnerships have to be embedded together. I think it's one of connection, where governments can really provide that connection. We've got to do real, I think, valuable partnerships. And an example may well be what the Commonwealth has done with the EU in the Horizons Venture program. This is 170, I think, billion euros, Tim, I think, where there's a real R&D partnerships across all of our institutions between the EU and Australia. And I think something like that can actually and should be a real focus for governments, state governments and the Commonwealth and our institutions to really embed this partnership. We have so many Indian students who come to Australia to study, and we have our transnational campuses offshore in India as well. But it can't be just a transactional basis where we're just selling educational degrees. It has to be, I think, a much deeper level where there are partnerships, there are joint ventures, there are, co-investments. These are the things that I think they're going to make a difference when it comes to, not just in the space industry, but I think in all industries as well. But I think fundamentally, I think people underestimate and perhaps don't understand the importance of the space industry as part of the digital future and the digital economy for both nations.
Thank you, Minister. Towards this, I think a panel earlier spoke about how India and Australia should actually think about working in trilaterals and actually leverage partnerships with other countries as well. I mean, here the biggest player in space is the US, right? And both Australia and India have sort of signed the Artemis Accords as well. Should there be some thinking put into what layer of the value chain can both India and Australia possibly partner with the US on? Because India has a lot of capabilities in Earth observation, low-cost launches, satellite manufacturing, and I think Australia provides a lot of sort of IT talent as well. So, has there been any thought given by the New South Wales government in terms of how can it sort of integrate itself into these larger multilateral programs on space cooperation?
Oh, yes, fundamentally, I mean, we've got a real space hub out just near Botany. We've got the Space Machines Company, which I think Raj launched a satellite, I think, early this year, maybe, or recently last year. It's fantastic. So I think to integrate into that sort of future economy, you need some fundamental frameworks, don't you? You need a very skilled workforce. You've got to have great research institutions, and you've got a government that's actually focused on the digital future. And that's why, through the creation, for example, of the Investment Delivery Authority, we are seeking more expressions of interest for investment in New South Wales in the digital economy, through data centres and through other advanced manufacturing space as well. So in that sense, trying to make sure that that investment doesn't experience loopholes, or not loopholes, but rather impediments, and also where government departments are actually not talking to each other. We actually want to de-risk the administrative process and the investment experience for investors so they can continue to invest in New South Wales. I think these opportunities are too big to miss, and I always think that there's always a risk in every decision that you make, but I think there's a greater risk in actually not making those decisions at all. So there's got to be a real commitment and a real focus in the New South Wales government, and we'll work with our friends in the Commonwealth to make sure that this is a reality, because this is about the future of employment, of income, of economic opportunity, and also what is a very competitive global race in this sector.
Thank you, Minister. Paul, I know that you've worked both in the PMO and the past, right? The Prime Minister's office, and now I know you're the CEO of Austrade. I guess it's a very simple question, but really, if you're sort of talking about spurring the bilateral tech partnership, so to speak, in the future between India and Australia, which will eventually lead to, more investments also into each other as well. Which side has a larger role to play here? I mean, given your experience, is it the government which sort of, sets the rules for everybody else, and then the private players come in and then, essentially go and play their role? Or is it more nuanced? Is it more organic, where sort of, it's a very day-by-day thing? How would you sort of, place that balance in terms of who does more and what more can be done when it comes to incubating a tech partnership between the government and the private sector?
I'd say it always comes down to business and individual business decisions. At the end of the day, it's business that's making these decisions. Government can set up frameworks We can set up approaches. We can identify the opportunity, but it's ultimately business that translates that into real action. For that reason, we're putting a real emphasis in the work that we're doing in the Australian Trade and Investment Commission in building deeper partnerships with business to work more closely with business in finding those opportunities. So at the moment, we are working on the development of an Accessing New Markets initiative with a trade diversification network that Austrade's working closely with 40 peak industry bodies here in Australia. And one of the key things we're saying to those peak industry bodies, remember India. Think about the opportunities in India, and they can then think about in a deeper, more substantive way where the opportunities are going to be. And indeed, we're very, very encouraged with some of the things that we're seeing in precisely in the sectors that we've been talking about today. But at the end, in the final analysis, these are decisions that are being made by business. So I would say business has the most, once governments have created the frameworks, then it's up to business to drive things forward.
Sure, thanks. I think we've reached the audience Q&A round now and sort of very keen to take some questions from the floor. If you can just introduce yourself and the person on the panel who you want to raise the question to. So, J.S. Deepak, sir.
My name is Rajat Kathuria. I'm from Vishwanath University in the National Capital Region. My question is, since the morning, a lot has been said about efficiency, promotion of efficiency through the ECTA, through investments. And I think Lisa made the point, if I remember, that there's been a collapse of the distinction between, I guess, economic interests and geopolitical interests. And attributed it to Shashi Tharoor. And I guess one way to sort of contest that, it's always been the case. Sometimes less, sometimes more, but it's always been the case. But geopolitical interests have, in some sense, related to standards, I guess, also CPTPP, harmonization of standards, etc. But that's one sort of the argument. The other argument about national interests, and this is sort of my question, especially to the Australian counterparts and reflecting on efficiency, is when you have these discussions on trade and when India looks at its own interests, are discussions around the employment effects of trade ever discussed? So one view is, of course, mobility, right? I mean, you'll create employment and there will be, and India, and Pramit was saying there will be sort of mobility in the next round of discussion. But I think if geopolitical interests, if national interests are going to be paramount for sort of a lot of the countries, and they are now, India's national interests would reflect on not only efficiency, but also the old sort of jargon of economists, equity. But equity as manifested in what are the employment effects? Are these discussions at all had when the ECTA, when the trade agreement is being discussed?
Good morning, Stuart Dunn from AusPac Hydrospatial. A little bit of unsolicited feedback to Austrade. Really love what Austrade does around the world. I've interacted with Austrade in numerous countries, and it really is an excellent service. I guess I'm going to oversimplify this to some extent. If it was commercially viable and easy to do, industry would invest in other countries. But obviously there's limits and constraints, and some of those are policies, processes, regulations, and risk. And the Minister opened the door on risk. So the question that I've got to the panel is, what are the risks of investing in Australia from the Indian perspective?
So Paul, if you could just take on the first question from J.S. Deepak about, what is the reason why the kind of, CEPA, which might be there between India and Australia, will not have certain provisions which India did with Korea and Japan?
So specifically around investment. And so, well, in fact, it'd be interesting to sort of talk about investment from both perspectives. And one of the themes that's really been drawn out from the discussions today is the fact at the end of the day, it will be business that's making its decisions based on risk and return and where the opportunity is. In Australia, we need to look at those opportunities of reducing risk of investing in Australia, and that has been a key priority of the government, including in its budget that was announced as the Commonwealth government, including in the budget that was announced last week, with the next stage of the work around the investor front door into Australia, but particularly looking at opportunities of reducing costs and uncertainty around investment and some of the regulations that drive investment. One of those is in the key area of environmental approvals, which have been an important issue for Indian investors coming into Australia. And I know New South Wales government has been working very closely with the Commonwealth government on reforms in those areas. So this is a two-way thing. In Australia, we're looking at how we reduce the barriers for investment into Australia. We also need to be working together in how do we build greater confidence but greater knowledge of the investment opportunities in India. And that's why I would highlight the work that Austrade's doing in a practical way with investors at the moment to find those opportunities in India. And hopefully that will help with the broader enterprise of negotiating the next CECA agreement.
Pramit, can you take on the question asked earlier by Rajat about essentially, our sort of work employment issues sort of factored in during trade discussions, at least when it comes to the India and Australia CECA?
So, as you know, jobs is a political issue in pretty much every country in the world. That even in places like Northeast Asia will have massive demographic declines. They even have anti-migrant parties now. So I would say a couple of things. I think the game for most governments right now is that the easy part of any mobility agreement, as you said, is not about migration, it's about talent, right? And the battle for talent, I would argue, is getting even more extreme. I will bring in my daughter as an example, who graduated from Imperial College in London, was looking for a job. She's a STEM graduate, and she's a specific technology. It's an oncological spatial proteomicist. I don't understand what it is. But, she applied for an H-1B visa. She got a job offer in America, and she went to the visa office in London. I, being a father, said, be warned, it's a terrible time to get H-1B visas. Be prepared for rejection, delay, everything. Rang me up and said, Dad, as usual, you don't know anything. Because that was the easiest visa I got in my life. So she says, I just went in there, I gave it in, and the visa officer just typed in, spatial proteomics is a technology. That is critical emerging technology. This is the American policy. No quota, no wait, instant visa. Unlimited visas are issued in all of these 600 technologies. And 15 minutes later, 3-year H-1B visa, please go to the United States whenever you want. The point is, I mentioned this to many other governments, and they said, we all desperately need to do the same thing. Because that's the problem. The Europeans said, we're desperately trying to put that together now because this battle for those top technologies, everybody is massively short. And when I have my company, Eurasia Group, we have 1,200 multinational clients. They say we are desperate for top-level talent. I mean, we have shortages in every single technology that's going on. And my way is that's the easy wedge to get a mobility agreement through, is to go for the talent side of the story. That we are not going to be we are going to lose out on strategic technology unless we are able to tap a global pool, of which India is one of the biggest. And then when you put in the geopolitics, i.e. we're not going to allow Chinese to enter or limit Chinese or Russians into that space, then it gets much, much worse. Somebody was mentioning about quantum in Australia. The problem that I face right now when I talk to quantum is I was in Canada, I talking to Canadians, they said, we're top 5 on quantum. I was in Taiwan, we're in the top 5 in quantum. There are 27 countries in top 5 in quantum now. And so if I am, either when it comes to the talent or if I'm a company or an investor, I'm looking, everybody's good in quantum. Rwanda is good in quantum if you talk to them, right? But working out who exactly is there is often a B2B decision. And it often is just about awareness. One of the weaknesses Australia has as a risk factor is that it's not seen as a tech center in other parts of the world, including India. That's changing very slowly. Canada had a similar kind of problem, but it's still seen as United States towering above everybody else, then the Japanese, some elements of Europe, the Nordics, for example, in particular. And then there's a huge drop-off in which there's like 20 other countries all fighting at about the same level. So the risk factor, I think the talent battle is the heart of what you're going to have to do to sell mobility. After that, it starts to make it easier to allow other bits and pieces. It is also politically, which has been the case definitely in the United States and even in Europe, is that if you get the top talent coming in as your primary immigration wedge, the population tends to be much more agreeable about those people coming, other people from that country coming in. One of the reasons in America is so willing to accept across partisan, both Democrats and Republicans, about forget about what's happening in social media in America about Indians. You look at the polling evidence, Republicans and Democrats both say Indians are the best migrants that they can think of. We're seen as the model migrant population. Why? Because that surge at the beginning of the top-end talent that came in transformed the image of Indians in the United States. To this day, it's just assumed that these are they're called the new Jews, that they're the Jews at the top end of the immigration ladder. And that hasn't completely changed yet, even though we're now seeing a lot more working class Indians arriving there.
Thanks, Pramit. So, if I may offer a small observation here as well. The debate normally when it comes to R&D collaboration with Indian firms or with Indian talent has always been, portrayed as one of Indian talent sort of working in these, GCCs in India or moving overseas. I think one part of the equation which is often missed out on is that how Indian IT firms do create value. A lot of Indian firms, IT firms in the US create so many jobs over there as well. And oftentimes that is not highlighted enough, I think, especially because it's a very politically sensitive issue. But I think going ahead, I think probably the CEPA or the CECA in this case can has its task essentially cut out for it to essentially flag these issues as well in terms of how can talent be a two-way street. It shouldn't be just seen as, top Australian firms sort of, onshoring work to India. It should sort of be a true and genuine movement of talent and mobility across India and Australia as well. So with that, we close the session, and